Welcome. I mean, we got a lot of welcomes to the people, and thank you for everyone for both participating and attending, but I'm going to welcome you to a brave new world of oil, because that's really who's in the room. Is this something that is going to be very different? And I've heard from many people, some of whom are in this room, that the last 20, 30 years of knowledge that many of us have acquired in this subject is a primer for what we need to know, but it's not still complete. There is so much new about oil happening that we almost have to re-educate ourselves. This is about a paradigm shift. So those of you in the audience who really thrive on skating in terms of change and get excited about working on things when there's a change ahead, this is it. We're in moments of change. We saw it today in the paper with climate change, but in terms of energy supply, gas sector, oil sector, what's going on in coal, we're talking about real big changes. So I was going to ask for a free association with oil. When I say oil, what would you think in terms of free association? Transportation, right? That's what people think about, and it is true. Oil, about 70% of oil goes to transportation. But what's interesting when you look at the question from what is oil? Oil is so many things. Will still be transportation. That will always be a very dominant force, and we have to focus on that. But we can no longer just focus on transportation to solve oil issues. Oil is about 6,000 different products in our economy. Baby diapers, perfume, paint, plastic bottles. So it's everywhere, and oil, as it changes, becomes more things. And that's what I was going to talk to you about today. If in the end of this talk, you have more questions than you have answers, I will have succeeded. Because that's really what this paradigm shift is all about, figuring out what the right questions are. So this is oil, this is gas, this is coal, actually. This is hydrocarbons. This is the world of what fossil fuels are. But this is what oil is becoming. Oil is becoming, and it used to be, oil used to be this, and that, getting heavier over time. The last 25 years, if you worked in this sector or thought about it, you were really operating in this sphere. And the whole industry is designing around that sphere. And our products are set because that's the raw input. So we're making products out of what we've always been given. Now what's starting to happen is some oils are getting really light, natural gas liquids and condensates. Those actually don't even really make gasoline. We'll talk about that a little bit. They make other, petrochemicals, totally different thing. And now we saw with the BP spill, we're going really, really deep to get oil, but in unconventional ways or less conventional ways, where a big, big breakthrough is tight shale oils, oil that's not, it's trapped. That oil, actually we thought that oil would come out of the ground similar to conventional oil. Turns out a lot of that oil is coming out of the ground with more of this stuff in it, with a lot more natural gas and condensates. Then you get to extra heavy oils. California's been going heavy. Oil's been getting heavier and heavier. I'll tell you in a second what that means. But as it gets heavier, we are now venturing into, this is the really interesting part here. Bitumens are ancient oil. This is the oil sands up in Canada. There's also in Utah and in the western states and Venezuela, other places in the world. Bitumens have been in the ground so long that bacteria started to eat them apart. And they've taken the liquid out of the oil, and what remains is on its way to coal. You can make oil out of it, but it's kind of a transition between oil and coal. Carrigan is really interesting. This is the oil shale, not to be confused with what they call shale oil, but the oil shale, the Carrigan, which is in the Rocky Mountains, the big source that in the 70s we were starting to discover and think about using, this is immature oil. This hasn't been in the ground long enough to become oil. But we're so technologically adept at managing hydrocarbons and transforming them now, and we'll only get better at it, which is why as oils change, everything changes, because we perfect things. At least technologically we try to. So the oil shale Carrigan is immature, so we have to accelerate time with technology to turn that into oil. And the question about all of these is what's the price? And what's the access? Any and all of these can turn on at any point. There's no rationality right now to what turns on. We're in this transition, and it could all turn on at once like natural gas. It could actually hurt the market if it all turns on too quickly. And some of these things deserve to stay in the ground longer because they're very carbon intensive, and others should be managed better. So this goes into a little bit more detail in terms of what I was just saying. So you have all of your oils as they have been here clustered in the center. And what's interesting about this graph is to show you how different oil is becoming from itself. So not only is oil becoming all these different things, even what we called conventional oil, which is right here in the purple, is now actually differentiating. And then what's really interesting about this field, and why I want you to have questions, because we don't know enough about them yet, the information gaps Jessica mentioned, is what's happening at the edges. So we have what we've started with the extra heavy oils, the tar sands, the oil sands, and then we have these ultralight oils, which are coming from the Bakken in North Dakota and Eagle Ford in Texas. Those are very different, not only from oil, as we've known it, but from each other. So this is a story not only about oil, but also about the carbon embedded in it, because it's really that carbon that creates our climate challenge that we have. The rule of thumb is the heavier the oil, the higher its carbon content. And the reason that's the rule of thumb is that it's hydrocarbons, as we said. Hydrogen's very light, carbon's very heavy. So the more carbon in the oil, the heavier the oil. So if you have a barrel of bitumen and a barrel next to it of Eagle Ford ultralight oil, they're both the same volume. They weigh very different amounts. So this is interesting because it puts it in terms that you think of familiar substances. Bitumen is the consistency of window putty. And I tried to think of something you would even know, but the ultralight oils might be more the consistency of nail polish remover. Very volatile, it stinks, you don't want to keep it open very long. So these, if you think about window putty or peanut butter next to nail polish remover, you can automatically see we're trying to make the same old products out of very, very different inputs. So this is trying to take a building blocks, maybe we should call them building rings, just to give you a sense of the extra heavy versus the ultralight oils. Because again, it's at this periphery of oil where everything is changing the most. And the extra heavy oils, what this tries to show, without giving you too many numbers, is the darkest red are the building blocks of that oil that actually are the heaviest parts of that oil, the residual. It's the stuff that bottom of the barrel. So the extra heavy oils have a tremendous amount of bottom of the barrel. And then as it gets lighter red, the components, the building blocks get lighter, more toward gasoline. The center of the circle, the center circle is ultralight oil. And as you can see, there's very little residual bottom of the barrel in that ultralight oil. But that has a lot of white, which is more gas, more like natural gas. So these oils, last 3 slides have really made one point. These oils are really, really different. They're different from what oil's been, and they're really different from each other. So this is what we're up against. What are we going to do to turn these very different oils into something that we want? Because the bottom line is, no one wants raw oil. None of us can use raw oil. We talk about oil like it's a thing, but the reality is it's a feedstock. It's not anything we can use. It needs to be tremendously processed. And that's part of the paradigm shift, because all these processes have to change to accommodate the new oils. So this is like the Rube Goldberg of, a basic, the basics of a refinery. But as you can see in one schematic, depending on, again, the types of oils that come in, from the lighter oils in yellow to the heavier oils in red, you get a whole host of different products out. And what you get out has everything to do with what you put in. We're pretty heroic at transforming. We can even turn coal into gasoline if we want to. But when you do that, you have to put a lot more energy in and you get a lot more carbon out. So it transforms the carbon equation tremendously. So this is the oil supply chain. This is the, the center stage of the paradigm shift. This is where everything is going to change. From the how we explore and produce these things, basically how we extract them, to how we transport and refine them. Refining is going to be a huge shift. We could talk about that later. And then also what products they make. There are a lot of shifts. So I just wanted to give you quick visuals of what oil is and is the transitional and the conventional stuff versus what it might look like with growing unconventional oils. So you have standard production, you have fracked oil, that's the second picture. You have platforms offshore, some ultra deep, and then you have Arctic drilling in some situations. All of those are pretty much liquid oil as we know it. They come out in different ways, but they're liquid oil of varying types. Then you have to move them around. Either they go by pipeline, or they go by barge, or they go by tanker, or they go by rail tank. Interestingly, a lot more rail right now, moving oil around tremendously. And then they get refined into all the things that we need, these products. Largely, the lighter the oils, they go into the petrochemical feedstock, the gasoline, and the jet fuel, and the diesel. And that's our economy, largely those. This is the world of changing oil. This is the world at more of an extreme. This is when you dig for oil because, again, it's ancient and very solid. And this is when you have to gasify it, the second picture, underground. And this is where you are taking your carrigan out of the ground, very similarly digging it out. This is the immature oil they dig. Or this is where you're actually putting heat under the ground to get your carrigan in the Rocky Mountains and elsewhere. What changes when you deal with this is you still have transportation, both getting it to the processing and then products, but you need to add a step to upgrade it. It has too much carbon in it. That's what we've been talking about. So you need to have a much more complex refinery, and all the refineries in the US now have been upgraded to be these types of refineries. So we don't have refineries in the US largely that can deal with the light oil anymore. Because about 5 years ago, we thought all we were going to have was the extra heavy oil. So now these are the refineries, the upgraders, and then it still has to go to yet another step of being refined in an extra heavy refinery. So upgrading strips the carbon out, and then it has to still be refined. And then here's the kicker. You get different products out of it. You get some gasoline. You don't get petrochemical, much of any. You get some gasoline and diesel, a bit of diesel, and jet fuel, but then you get a lot more bunker fuel, the real heavy stuff, and then you get a lot of, very interesting because no one even knows about it, pet coke. Petroleum coke is the coal hidden in oil. It's that solid part that the bacteria left, and it has to be stripped off, and it goes into industry, it replaces coal. And what's interesting about the story is Canada's been stripping this off up in Canada, stockpiling it and shipping it to Asia. But the plan is to send it all down here. The plan is to bring all that raw bitumen here and strip it off in the US. And now we are going to have a lot of pet coke on our hands, which is, again, it's a paradigm shift. It's not something that we're being used to for oil. So the next step that we've been thinking about working on is indexing these oils. And indexing them in terms of both, I think this part left off, but in terms of their actual embedded carbon, what products they make in terms of combustion, because that changes, as we just said, and then also those process inputs, and Adam will talk a lot about that as well, because there are differences in these inputs when you put different oils in. And the two together, what you get out, the products and burning them, and what energy you put in to make it into those products in the first place, those two components are what end up being the real snapshot of how oils compare in terms of their carbon emissions. And you can't have one standard for all oils because all oils are very different. So if you want to manage carbon, you have to really start to disaggregate and ask about indexing oils. So these are some of the information gaps. I'll just leave you with some thoughts here because these are the big questions. No two rocks are the same. No two source rocks are the same. Therefore, even when you're talking about shale oil, no two shales are the same. No two bitumens are the same. So there's a lot of differentiation even within these types of oils, and there's a lot of information that we still need to know. The critical aspects of unconventional oil are not well understood, especially regarding climate, but also regarding water. There's a need for transparency and social responsibility here, bar none. We must know more about these things because these are huge investments. And once the infrastructure is built, it's very difficult, very costly to change it, and it's very disruptive. And then the third one I thought to put here was one I just caught recently, because it feeds into the whole idea of policy that we're aiming toward the end of the day, is that if we don't include the carbon emissions and the energy consequences of these oils into the equation, the market can't work well. We want to discuss having a free market. There's a lot of change in this sector, and the industry wants it to be free. But if there's no guidelines, then basically anything can happen. And as the University of Cambridge was arguing, we'll get questionable outcomes for trade and for investment. So I wanted to close with this, and it actually relates very sadly to all the stories today. This is a 1962 ad. And I came upon this because Steve Cole writes about it in his book. Thank you. When he comes up, thank him. 1962, Humble Oil. Humble Oil in 1962 said, there is enough energy in the Arctic to melt all of the glaciers. And that is something to celebrate. That's energy. That is like, that's cause, so, we are going, but the irony of all of this is now we circle back into all the CO2 that we've gotten from developing all the oil and all of the fossil fuels, and it's really that trapped CO2 that's melting all of the glaciers. So with that, I will, again, I think today is going to be a really good day to talk about the 21st century challenges that we have ahead of us. There is this oil optimism that David mentioned, but this climate challenge. And the question is going to be, in a very, optimistic time, how do you guide development when everyone is so excited about something new? I would argue it's the best time for rules, because if you don't have structure, it's very difficult for even industry to operate. But it's going to be very difficult. It's hard to tamp things down when times are bad, and we already know it's very difficult to modify things when times are good. I say we're in very good energy times, and the question is, how do we manage that?